Hello. This attachment training package has been developed by the Dover Specialist Teaching and Learning Service. The package includes this video and a list of really useful resources, including additional short videos, extra reading, and ideas for resources to use in your school. The video is in two parts. Part 1, delivered by Claire Cahill from the Kent Educational Psychology Service, explains about attachment theory and how a child with attachment difficulties might present in school. Part 2, delivered by Becky Davis from the Dover Specialist Teaching and Learning Service, will look at strategies and interventions that could be used to support children with attachment difficulties in school. There will be pauses throughout the video to allow for some group discussion during the training. At the end of the video, there is a link which takes you to an evaluation survey. We would really appreciate it if you could complete that survey. If you need any more information about training and resources delivered by the Dover STLS, please contact us through the website Dover STLS. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the training.
Okay, welcome everyone to today's attachment training session. I'm Claire Cahill, I work for Kent Educational Psychology Service. I'm sure a number of you will recognise me through delivering some previous training sessions and also from being in and out of your schools. I'm going to be talking to you today about attachment and largely focusing on the theoretical perspectives involved in attachment and the implication of those for children with attachment difficulties, linking that back to the kind of behaviours that we might see in our classrooms. And then there will be a separate session by Becky Davies from STLS, who's going to be thinking through some strategies with you for supporting children with attachment difficulties. Okay, so I'm going to just bring up the slides for today's training session. I'm hoping to be talking to you for about an hour this morning. And we're going to be covering, or hoping to cover, these 5 main objectives. So hopefully by the end of this morning's session, you will have an understanding of the main aspects of attachment difficulties in theory. You'll be able to think about the impact of early years experiences on children's abilities and their emotional responses. You'll have an understanding of children's schema as a result of their attachment difficulties and the impact of that upon their view of the world and the people around them, so that we can begin to think about how these children might be feeling, to view the world through their eyes and to think about how this might lead to some of the challenging behaviours that we're seeing in schools. You'll hopefully have greater knowledge about the different types of insecure attachment that you might see in children and be able to explore some of the strategies that can be used for supporting those pupils. And we'll be thinking a lot about how we can use the power of relationships and connections with our children to support them in school and to build their resilience and help them to form some more secure attachments. A couple of health warnings for today's session. There has been an increased awareness of attachment theories, and on the back of that there has been some concern that this can be used to blame parents for how they've brought up their children and the difficulties that are presenting. But I just want to make it really clear that that shouldn't be the case. As with any research and knowledge, the aim of it is actually that we're using that to inform practice and to support positive change, not to be placing blame in one particular camp or another. And then the second point is that there's also a tendency to use the term disorder inappropriately. And actually what we're doing through this training is considering different attachment styles. That doesn't mean that there's a disorder in medical terms. It's actually very hard to get a diagnosis of an attachment disorder, but it is important to be aware of those different attachment styles and to be thinking of those in relation to the children and young people that you're working with. And hopefully developing an understanding of attachment will help us to understand, how we relate to one another and how that lays the foundation for our future relationships. And essentially what we're trying to promote the idea of is actually what's important is good enough parenting, and being consistent enough and responsive enough to our children's needs, to set them up with those internal working models that will support them through later life. Okay, so I'd just like you to take a couple of moments to think about the couple of points that are up on your screens, and perhaps make a few notes for yourself. In terms of what do you think of when you hear the word attachment? So what does that mean to you currently? And how do you think attachment might affect children, young people's resilience, their self-esteem and their mental health? So perhaps just have a look at those questions, make a couple of notes in relation to each, and keep those questions in mind during the course of this training. And I suggest that maybe at the end of the session this morning, you might want to go back and revisit those for yourself, and perhaps add to some of your initial notes based on the information that you would have picked up throughout the course of this session. So just keep those in mind as we're going through the information in today's course. Okay, so attachment theory started initially in psychiatry, and it's now recognised to be actually a really vital factor in child development, and really important in the development of various skills for children, and as I said earlier, how they go on to build, future relationships and so on in later life. It's essentially about an emotional connection or bond that lays a number of important foundations. So it's that deep emotional connection / bond between the infant and their primary caregiver. That can be multiple, it doesn't have to be a singular figure, but the main, influential caregivers in their lives. That bond is considered to last over time, and create a sense of safety and stability for that child. It helps them to learn about themselves, about other people, about events and objects, and it shapes how they will relate to the world and the relationships that they will form throughout life. So it's the foundation that we kind of build our future relationships on, and because essentially at the basis of that is the development of our trust in others. It lays the foundation for that idea of trust in future relationships. So what is the effect of attachment on children's development? We know that it shapes how we respond to new experiences and therefore how we develop. And it does that because it provides a secure base. If you have a secure attachment, that will provide you with a secure base, which enables you to feel able to explore, to take risks and to learn because you feel safe in doing so. So having that secure base is what opens us up to new experiences, and gives us the confidence to engage in that development and learning. It will affect several factors for children and young people, including their self-concept, their ability to self-regulate, their skills in social interaction, and their learning and development. And so we're able to feel safe and secure through a secure attachment, and so therefore we're curious, we're more willing to explore, we're able to place ourselves outside of our comfort zones and to accept unpredictability and to be able to manage that. So that's really key. We can cope with that, coming our way because we've got that sense of safety and security. It develops our ability to attend to others, so it develops our attention skills. It enables us to engage in reasoning and problem solving skills, and importantly, not to become overwhelmed by those skills and to be able to kind of work through difficult experiences. It also enables us to label and express ourselves, and so therefore it provides models for our future interactions, and it can develop our sense of value and our sense of self-worth. And it's essentially the process by which we begin to view ourselves as an individual person and as separate to others. So we recognise that we have our own needs that are separate to those of other people. So a really important, concept in our early lives that has big implications for a number of aspects of children's development. And how does this link back to learning specifically? So what does the research tell us? There have been a number of studies that have considered the effect of the attachment relationship upon learning skills and upon academic achievement. I've listed those studies here for you to go away and do some further reading and research about, because we don't have time to look at each of those in turn today, but you might find it helpful to just go away and look up some of those studies and consider some of the key points there. But findings have essentially showed that there is a relationship between attachment and academic achievement, and the kind of factors that are influenced are children's ability to learn, which again goes back to that sense of security and willingness to explore, their ability to sustain attention, so the development of those concentration and attention skills, their cognitive and memory functions. So there is evidence to show that attachment relationships can produce, stronger skills in memory and better cognitive skills. It also is really key in supporting the development of language and communication, which we know links strongly to children's learning skills. And it also, as we've mentioned already, provides that sense of self. So therefore, we know that the attachment relationship that children form can have a really significant impact on both the behaviour and the learning of the pupils that we see in our schools. And yeah, it would be a good idea to go away and have a look at some of those papers and to just have a think about the impact of those early relationships upon the type of learning skills and the readiness for learning that we're seeing in children and young people at school. Okay, so it's only relatively recently that we've actually begun to study and understand the importance of attachment in relation to children's development. And the main features of attachment theory were first developed kind of over and presented over several decades, beginning in around the 1950s. And this was by a child psychiatrist called John Bowlby. And he was the first to suggest that the early development of a mother-child bond is crucial for healthy emotional development and the impacts of that on later behaviour. It is important to acknowledge that at this stage, we're talking about a mother-child bond, but obviously, now we know that broadens out and could include a father-child bond or a grandparent-child bond. It's just important that there's a strong, bond between a child and a primary caregiver of some form. And Bowlby was particularly interested in evolutionary theory, where safety lies in the proximity to the primary caregiver or the extended group. So he kind of recognised that it wasn't necessary for it to be one person that the child had this close bond with, but more often than not, it did relate to a particular key person, but it could involve several. And his theory was based on his research with 44 delinquent children, as they were called in those days, and he found that over half of those children had been separated from their mum for 6 months or more before the age of 5 years old. And based on that observation, he then started to notice links between maternal deprivation and child psychopathology while he was working in his clinic. And he went on to conclude that from that attachment in the early years are related to the emotional and behavioural needs later in life. And again, you can go away and do some further reading about that initial study and so on, and find some more detail on that if you wish to. So he essentially put forward this idea that a child with secure attachment experiences early on will approach the world more effectively and with more confidence because they would have a secure internal working model. And he also recognised at that stage that attachment need can often and is often throughout life. So although, there's a heavy dependence on it in our early years and as young children, actually as teenagers and in young adults, we still often look to home when things get tough for that support network. So it's a bond that lasts throughout life and that we continue to go back to. And he was coined the father of attachment theory as a result of his work. And the main idea coming out of that was that, for good mental health, the young child needed to have experienced a warm, intimate and continuous relationship with his mother / primary caregiver. Okay. So we've mentioned internal working models already this morning. And this was an idea put forward by Bowlby in the 70s. And the idea is essentially that it's a model that we develop based on our experiences in our early years, and it affects our belief system about the world. So it's essentially the schema that we develop that is based on our experience of the world, and that then affects how we interpret various events that happen to us and what we expect to happen in certain situations. And it enables us to anticipate and interpret others' behaviours, so to predict those based on the model that we've developed. And that view of the world remains stable over time unless there's intervention to change that. So that early model that we develop will be the one that guides our kind of experiences of the world and of our interactions with others. And that will remain stable over time based on those initial experiences that we have. And originally this work by Bowlby and people like him was based on observations of behaviour. And they were looking at, children in different settings and observing the kind of behaviours that they were displaying and basing their theories on those understandings. But more recently, actually, that the evidence from scans of the developing brain are also helping to suggest that they had the right idea. So we're now able to use those early observations and to map them onto brain scans. And those scans are providing supporting evidence for those initial ideas. Because those scans are helping to show that the brain is use dependent and that nurturing experiences shape how it develops. And we'll go on to have a look at that in a little bit more detail later on this morning. But essentially just important to bear in mind at this stage that our early attachment experiences will, from those we will form this internal working model. And that model is then what we use to guide our interactions with our environment and our expectations of the people within those environments. Okay. So what does a healthy attachment cycle look like? Essentially, a healthy cycle will develop from an adult noticing, understanding and responding to a child's needs. So a child or baby will have a need, they will cry to signify that need, and the need would then be met by their caregiver. And from that cycle, the child learns trust. They learn to understand that their needs will be met and that they can rely on that caregiver to meet their needs consistently. And those needs will be various forms. So it could be a physical need in that they're hungry or they're uncomfortable. It could be an emotional need in that they just want a cuddle or want to be held. Or it could be a communication need where they're looking to an adult, they're trying to engage in smiling, they're babbling. But the idea is that in a secure attachment relationship, the baby would signal that need to their caregiver. The caregiver would recognise that, would respond to that. And through that response, that cycle of and circle of trust develops. So that healthy attachment would occur when the infant experiences the primary caregiver as consistently providing those physical and emotional essentials, in addition to basic necessities of things like food and shelter and clothing and so on. And we would expect a caregiver in this cycle to be positive towards the child, to be warm and nurturing, very reassuring, and to be really encouraging the child to communicate. So lots of eye contact, body language, talking. And in this way, they're helping the child to feel safe by providing and meeting their needs. And that means that that child is therefore not experiencing anxiety, and that anxiety is not caused because they're getting those needs met. So the stimulus that they present is managed and their feelings are therefore regulated. And this process is obviously particularly present in children, in young babies who need others to have their needs met. They rely on others to do that for them. It's a process which generally peaks around kind of 2 to 8 months. And it's through that the foundations of attachment behaviours are laid down. So actually in that, really early stage of a young baby's life. And they then from that cycle go on to develop related beliefs and expectations about their caregivers. And that's primarily that relationships exist and that adults are predictable and that they can be trusted. And that's what lays the foundation for essentially that set of communication strategies which evolve over time and later help to develop meaningful social interactions. Okay, So what are the functions of attachment? What is the purpose of it? What does it help us with? Essentially, it provides us initially with a sense of security. So the child and the adult are involved in the initiation, the regulation, and the termination of the interaction, and they're both active partners in that. And through that, the child learns to orient towards others, to attend, to cope with the stimulus, a response to that, and then be able to withdraw from that. So there's that kind of mutual dance of responsiveness where two are involved and you're managing that interaction. And you'll notice there that it's kind of labelled attunement, and we will be thinking about that, as I said, a bit further on this morning as well, because that attunement and process is seen to be, the core experience of the secure attachment, that ability to relate to another. It also helps us to regulate our emotions and our arousal levels, because through the attachment cycle, the adult is able to take on the child's anxiety and their feelings of upset and to contain that in a safe way, and then reflect that back to the child, and therefore show an ability to cope. So in this way, they're also showing that they're able to understand the child, and they're making sure that those feelings don't overwhelm the child, so that the child can therefore learn to manage them. So they're taking those big feelings on for the child, preventing that sense of flooding, and showing them that actually, although big feelings can be difficult, we can cope with them and we can manage them, and they're feeding back that capacity to the child, and that skill goes on to develop as the child grows older. It also, another key function of attachment is around our expression of feeling and communication. So the adult will do things like comment on their own experiences and label these, and that encourages the child to develop this skill. So they're developing their own language skills through that interaction, and they're also beginning to recognise their emotions. So through that labelling that we do of emotions, they're also able to begin to put feelings into words, and to label those. And then finally, it provides that safe base for exploration. So the child is secure in the knowledge that the adult will be available if they're needed, and they know that they can return to the caregiver, for that sense of reassurance, really, if they begin to feel a bit unsafe. And that therefore allows them to explore and to be curious in new environments, knowing that they've got a safe space to retreat to if they need to. So it's encouraging that sense of independence and autonomy, which goes on to have good implications for their learning ability. Okay, but we also know that some children aren't able to develop a secure attachment with their caregivers, and that they might have what we could call a disturbed attachment cycle. So children in these cycles don't experience that secure base. They therefore don't necessarily feel able to explore, which has implications for their learning. And they are anxious children, and their needs are interrupted by their need to feel safe. So they're seeking that feeling safe, and they're not able to achieve that. And in this cycle, the baby would have a need. They would signal that need to an adult, but for whatever reason, the caregiver isn't able to meet that need. And so the child begins to learn that actually adults are unpredictable, and that they won't necessarily always meet the child's needs. So that's what it would look like if we had an interrupted or disturbed attachment cycle. And in this model, the child's feelings tend to feel more overwhelming and more unbearable, because they're not being fed back in a way that are manageable for the child. And often then they will go on to start to behave in ways which take away those negative feelings, which might relate to some of the behaviours that we're seeing in school. Their development of self-esteem can be very poor, because they see themselves as not worthy of support. They can't trust other people to help them. They don't establish that sense of belonging, and they can feel very misunderstood. And we have a number of different types of insecure attachment style, which again we will go on to think about during the course of this morning. And so we could often refer to these children as having an insecure attachment, but you might also hear it referred to as developmental trauma if we're talking about attachment difficulties. It can also come under the umbrella of developmental trauma. So if you hear that term used, it might also be, signify attachment needs. Okay, so there are a number of factors that can influence the attachment process and present challenges to that. So there are a number of reasons as to why that primary caregiver may not be able to meet the young baby's needs. And I've listed a few of these for you. I mean, obviously there are other factors out there, but these are a few factors to kind of keep in mind, essentially. So one of those can be parents experiencing a child who has special needs at birth. And this can just be really hard for parents to come to terms with if it was very unexpected, and they're then trying to manage the loss of the child that they thought they had, and they're uncertain how to provide that appropriate support. So that can be quite a significant factor in affecting that attachment process. Family size can also be an influencing factor, because parents are having to divide their attention, they're having to limit time. So if you have very large families, that might be a factor for a young baby. The caregiver's capacity, so they could be very tired, leading to high levels of negativity. And I think that's, particularly something to bear in mind at the moment with the pandemic and so on that we're all living through. I think particularly for new mothers, having children in lockdown and so on, that's been a really, really difficult experience, where I imagine capacity of their caregivers has been very reduced. And so we may well see, some significant implications of that further down the line, where just that access to support networks has been, so absent. Previous parenting is also a really key factor. So what was the caregiver's experience of parenting? Do they have an appropriate model? Often they will be lacking, a secure model on which to base their own parenting style. And so therefore they can be really unsure about how best to interact and support their child's own development. So that's an important factor to bear in mind. And also, factors like adoption and so on can have an impact on that process, where children are perhaps reluctant to invest in those relationships, those new relationships, because of the level of distrust and so on they may already have developed. So there can be all kinds of factors that are affecting that process. And I think it's important to be thinking about those when we're working with individual children and young people, and to be trying to track that back to, actually what might be going on for this family and what factors might be involved here. So worth keeping those in mind. Unsettled babies is another one there, which I think can be really common. So we know that a lot of little really newborn babies can be very unsettled if they're very uncomfortable and so on, and that can just lead to a lot of crying in those early weeks and months, which can be really unnerving for new parents and very difficult for them to manage. And if you feel like you're never getting it right, then you there's almost that cycle of then you stop kind of trying to respond to those needs, which then can have a real impact on that attachment cycle. Okay. So to further explore this idea of attachment theory, Mary Ainsworth, who I'm sure is someone a number of you will have heard of before, devised an experimental procedure called the strange situation. And this set up a situation in which a toddler was briefly separated from their parent under controlled conditions in order to test their reactions to the parent's departure, and then look at the subsequent reunion, as well as also looking at the arrival and departure of a stranger to the room. So they essentially looked at the child's response to the parent leaving the room and coming back, as well as the response to a stranger entering the room and then leaving again. And this has proved to be such a reliable measure of the quality of the parent-infant relationship that it's actually been used with a high level of confidence ever since, and as a springboard for kind of future research, essentially. And you'll notice at the bottom there, I'm not going to play it today, but you can go and have a look at that clip, which shows you that process in action, if you like. It's a recording of that strange situation taking place. And essentially from this experiment, Mary Ainsworth suggested essentially that there were 4 different types of attachment styles. So there were those children that were securely attached, and that accounted for approximately 75%, of children, so roughly 75% of children will have a secure attachment model. And then she identified a further 3 styles of insecure attachment. And you can see there that there are different percentages in relation to the number of children that would be expected to fall under those different models. And they were anxious avoidant, anxious resistant, and then at a later stage there was a further style identified known as anxious disorganized, which is considered to be the most rare form of attachment style. I think it's important at this stage to recognise that, you know, we don't necessarily need to label children, but it can with these different attachment styles. And as I said earlier, it's actually very difficult to get a diagnosis of an attachment disorder and to have yourself classed as a particular attachment style. But it is useful to, you know, bear these different categories in mind, because that can be helpful in our understanding of how early attachment experiences can contribute to our emotional and cognitive development, and hence the school readiness that we're seeing in our children and young people. And it just helps us to hold in mind that children come to school with a wide range of early years experiences, and those are likely to be impacting to some degree on their readiness to engage with school and with learning. So in relation to this experiment, if a child was securely attached, they would often, the behaviour that they would display would be that they would be distressed when the mother left, but easily comforted when she returned. So they would be worried that she'd gone, but as soon as mum came back, they would be very easily comforted and reassured that she had returned. Children that were anxious avoidant, the pattern of behaviour that they saw was that the child would avoid contact on the reunion. So when mum came back, they would avoid contact with her. Anxious resistant, they would be resistant to that contact on reunion, so they wouldn't necessarily avoid it, but they would be very resistant to it. And children that were anxious disorganised showed no pattern of behaviour at separation or reunion. And these different types of attachment will also present differently in school. So as we've kind of thought about already, the securely attached children that we see would be ready to learn, would be confident in exploring, would be able to cope well with setbacks, and they importantly can form strong, trusting adult relationships. Those children that are anxious avoidant would find it difficult to ask for help. They would become self-reliant. They often adopt false confidence, so they can appear overly confident. They may have behaviour problems, and they would typically find it harder to form close and trusting relationships because their caregiver was potentially unavailable or rejecting of that reassurance for them. And then the children that would be classed as anxious resistant or anxious ambivalent is another term you might hear used there. They tend to be more insecure and attention seeking in school. And as adults, they will have strong feelings of dependency, which can be really stressful for their partners and those that they build relationships with. These children typically fear separation, and they will try to cling, to possess and to intrude. And they're likely to have had parents that were just largely inconsistent in responding. So sometimes they would have responded to their child's needs, and other times they wouldn't have been able to. So that inconsistency has developed that insecurity for them, and their need for kind of clinging to others because they don't know what to expect. And then finally, anxious disorganised children are those that present with severe and challenging behaviour. They're often very hypervigilant, so looking around their environment, a strong lack of trust, trying to control their environment because previously their experience of that is just chaotic. And so they try to manage that by taking control of the elements that they can. It's really important, I think, to be aware of the fact that these different attachment styles can often be mistaken for other medically diagnosable conditions like ASD and ADHD. You know, and I know that in Kent we have a lot of children now with a diagnosis of ASD and ADHD, and perhaps we need to think about other things that might be underlying those children's needs, and they can often be confused with attachment needs, and that is linked to things like the children's displays of high levels of vigilance, their poor attention skills, their poor social skills, and their difficulties with emotional literacy. So yeah, those attachment difficulties are likely to have had implications in all of those areas, but equally there are also difficulties that we see in children with ASD and ADHD. And so yeah, sometimes those difficulties can be mistaken and can be mislabeled. So it's important to bear that in mind when we're working with our children and young people in school, and really think about actually what are the cause of these behaviours, where are they coming from, and you know, which difficulty might they be relating to. And we're going to be thinking a little bit more about each of the attachment types outlined here. But what's important also to be aware of is that there are going to be lots of strategies presented to you, a few today and then further consideration through Becky. But these strategies will also just be useful for all children, particularly if they've experienced some form of trauma or loss. Okay. So what are the effects on everyday functioning? We've touched upon this a little bit in terms of thinking about how these different children might present in school. But again, you know, there's just some further ideas there under each attachment style. So those children that are insecure, avoidant, have had that rejecting relationship, where the parent, finds it difficult to just acknowledge the child and to respond to them. That's often due to factors such as depression or substance misuse and so on. And therefore then the child finds it difficult to trust others. They think that others don't like them or want to engage with them. So there's a real impact on that kind of self-esteem and self-value. And they often avoid interaction with caregivers on reunion, because that trust isn't there. They don't know how to respond to that attention from their caregiver when they do get it. Those children that are insecure or ambivalent or resistant have that inconsistent relationship where the parent is sometimes in tune with their child and at other times they're not. And again, that can be due to parental mental health, and those unpredictable mood swings, to substance misuse, to a number of other factors. And these children often want that love really desperately, and they're often those people pleasers. They're at much greater risk of peer pressure because they just want to kind of be accepted and to belong, and they can alternate between wanting to be really close to their primary caregiver and then becoming quite hostile towards them because they're just reflecting that inconsistency and that unpredictability. And then finally we have that disorganized or disorientated attachment style, and this is one where there's been quite a scary relationship between the child and the parent. So there might have been some form of child abuse, there might have been domestic violence in the home, there might be factors such as crime involved, and the child is then fearful of others and very hypervigilant, so constantly aware of what's happening in their environment. They don't know how to make sure that their primary caregiver will stay with them and keep them safe, and during reunion they often become very distressed and will try to avoid their caregiver and seem to be fearful of them, and these children just constantly feel unsafe and have no trust for any others. That style, so that final style, is obviously the one that presents the most concern for us, and some research suggests that approximately 80% of maltreated children will have this type of attachment styles. And I guess what's important when we're looking at these different kind of styles of attachment to reflect upon is that, you know, schools are usually really busy places. There's lots going on, there's lots of different adults. And if you don't have a good attachment to your caregivers, and therefore you've developed that ability to regulate your emotions, it can feel like a really stressful place. And it also leads to then a lot of difficulties in terms of making new relationships with adults and peers. So, you know, for those children that we have in our schools with attachment difficulties, actually school can feel like a really overwhelming environment, and it's important that we kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so what would be the signs of attachment difficulties that we might see? So we would, you know, potentially be expecting these children to not have that secure base, so they don't feel able to explore and to learn because they're just overly anxious. we would see a lot of automatic responses, so children that are constantly in that fight, flight, freeze response, and that are unable to respond to logic or to reason. Children with high levels of impulsiveness potentially, so they've got less control over their behaviour and they're not able to recognise the consequences because they haven't got that model and that cycle to refer back to. They can be very attention seeking, so those overly clingy children and children that are really overly affectionate with strangers as well as adults they know. Often those children that are quick to tell you their whole life story even if they've never met you before. Not having a filter on those kind of relationships and what isn't appropriate. We might see that kind of push-pull behaviour, particularly those children that have experienced those inconsistent relationships where the adult has at times been available and at others not. So their behaviour will reflect that. At times they'll want that interaction and at others they won't be able to manage it. Children that are avoiding attention completely, they don't want to be helped, they don't want any adult input, they're refusing to engage because they've just got that complete lack of trust in their supportive adults. Children with really strong emotional responses who are really difficult to calm down. Children with low self-concept and really low confidence. Children that are showing very controlling behaviour, again, because they're trying to, make their environment feel a little bit more predictable for them. And children that have changes in routines and transitions. So again, those are the kind of things that we might be picking out as an indicator that children have an attachment difficulty. But again, I think, looking at those, you'll be able to relate that back to, other diagnoses as well. So you can see the difficulty in trying to distinguish what might be an appropriate diagnosis or otherwise for children. And it's important to be keeping those factors in mind and therefore really trying to link it back to what's going on for this individual child or young person. Okay, we spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that we're now able to use brain scans and imaging to think about the impact of attachment on children's development. And so this slide is just a further reflection on that, really. And it's showing us a little bit more about what is going on inside a child's brain. So we know that the brain is use dependent and develops in response to the experiences that we have. And you can see from your slide there, hopefully, that the image on the left is of a typically developing child, I suppose, or a healthy attachment, whereas the image on the right is from a child who would have had an insecure attachment style or have been neglected in their early years. And you can see that there's, huge gaps on that image in terms of areas of the brain that have not developed because they haven't had those experiences and therefore, built up those neural pathways and so on in the same way. And that has huge implications, subsequently for their development in terms of their cognitive functioning, their emotional functioning, their behavioural functioning. And we can quite clearly see that on those scans, which I think is crazy that we're now able to use that kind of science to look at these things. And so the brain activity of the normal child on the left, and then on the right hand side, that image is of a Roman orphan who was institutionalized and was neglected in infancy. So you can really see the discrepancy there, with areas like the temporal lobes, really significantly reduced. We know that among other functions, the temporal lobes are really responsible for our emotional regulation. And actually that image shows that, that those areas are practically inactive in comparison to the healthy child, which just shows the kind of magnitude of those early experiences on later development. And research has shown those brain differences in people of all ages who've experienced trauma, because the brain essentially develops from the bottom up. So we'd have the brainstem first, and then the more complex and thinking structures. And so it's those more complex and thinking structures that develop later that are the areas that are affected through neglect and so on, because those neurons aren't learning to fire and to work together in the same way, and so those pathways aren't developing. And I think, yeah, I just think that that's quite a telling image, really, and one to keep in mind. And it shows how extensive those kind of early experiences, the impact of those early experiences can be for later development. But we do also know that that neuroplasticity, so that ability to develop pathways and so on, continues throughout the life cycle. So there is potential for change. So even if a child has had difficult early experiences, actually there are periods of development where those pathways can grow again. There's that potential for change, and so we can help children to learn to regulate through attuned relationships later in life, and that can help to alter their attachment pattern, which I think is really powerful as well. And this is, just reiterating that point, really, that at birth we have 50 trillion synapses. By 3 years we have 1,000 trillion synapses. So those early years are really important because we've got all those different connections that we could be developing if we're getting that appropriate input. And it's through that kind of pruning process that those pathways develop. And we're constantly growing all those new synapses in those early years. And if we've got the appropriate cycles and support in place, then we will be, those synapses will be becoming more established, and they will be forming those patterns within our brain. And it's the attachment process that has a huge impact on that, through that bond that we develop with our caregiver and the interaction. So yeah, just reiterating that early point, really, that those first 3 years are really critical to brain development, because we know it's use dependent. And therefore, when a child doesn't have their needs met and there is a lack of a consistent response from adults, that then has an impact on the cognitive, emotional, social and behavioural development of our children. We know that by 2, an infant has as many neural connections as an adult, and that the quality of the attachment relationship affects which pathways are kept. And therefore, that we also know that children are really receptive to the environment from the moment that they're born. They're born with all of those, with all of those synapses and so on ready to fire, and they're born ready to engage with others, and to develop those pathways in response to the stimulus that they're exposed to. So the richer the experience of their interactions, the more neural connections which will grow, and the more their brain will develop. And in contrast, children that are in very stressful early years environments will experience a much higher level of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and that's then released into the baby's brain, and that destroys newly formed cells. So whereas secure children will hopefully be developing all these new pathways and really growing their brain, actually children that are living in very stressful environments, not only are they not forming those new pathways, but they're also experiencing high levels of cortisol, which can then destroy pathways that have been built. And it's that kind of process that then leads them to be governed by their limbic system. So they don't have perhaps some of those higher order cognitive areas. They rely more on the response of their limbic system, which is the early part of the brain that develops linked to the brainstem, and that's where we have all of that fight, flight, freeze response. So they're relying on their survival instincts as opposed to being able to do more of that later emotional regulation that's developed through the higher order parts of our brain. Okay. So earlier on we spoke about attunement, and the fact that that's important in an attachment relationship, and this is essentially referring to the contact and response of the primary caregiver, and that then helps the baby to organise their developing self and their brain. So it's the adult responding appropriately to the baby, which then in turn stimulates that brain development and helps the child to develop that sense of self. And the caregiver is, encouraging the baby. They're smiling, they're using language, they're using eye contact, and meeting all of those early needs. And we might also refer to that as primary intersubjectivity, But we know, therefore, that attunement is key to brain development in infants. So that early bond is really, really key to their later brain development. And this idea of primary intersubjectivity basically means that a child's emotions are expressed and then they are actively perceived by the adult. And I think a nice way of kind of framing attachment theory and thinking about this with families in such a way that you know, blame and guilt aren't apportioned for how that child's been brought up is by using the Solihull approach as the way of managing the effects of these different attachment styles and going on to support children and young people. And so the Solihull approach is a framework and intervention that uses principles in attachment theory to support children with attachment difficulties, or those that, you know, may just need additional nurturing and support with their relationships. So they don't even have to have an attachment difficulty as such. It's about children that just need that additional nurture and support in developing their relationships. And it's both a way of working with families and a way of thinking about our work. It's been designed as a brief intervention and also as an early intervention. It's not designed to solve all problems, but it is a nice model from which to start from. And essentially it has these 3 different areas of containment, reciprocity and behaviour management. And the idea is it's an integrated model, and all of those factors then feed into greater emotional self-regulation for the child. And it just gives us a framework for thinking about the child's relationships with others. And the idea is that, you know, those 3 concepts are the main elements, and if we can emotionally contain a child and relate to them reciprocally, then behaviour management will begin to develop independently. So in the Solihull model, the factors of containment and reciprocity would come first, and then from that we would expect to see improved behaviour management. So because the idea is that by developing greater emotional regulation first, the behaviour management would then follow. And would enable that self-regulation to develop. Okay, so the first aspect of this model then is containment. And essential to containment essentially is having your feelings thought about and understood, and hopefully handed back in a more manageable form. So that goes back to that idea of the caregiver recognising the emotion that the child is having, and feeding back to them that they don't need to be overwhelmed by it, and that they can manage that and it can be coped with. And they can move on from that. And then over time, the child or young person can then understand their emotions and begin to manage them better. So it's communicating back to the individual that, yes, it's a big emotion, but we can manage this, and it's not overwhelming. And this process then just restores the ability to think in the other person. So it takes away that kind of need to jump to that irrational and illogical response. And it gives them the space to be able to process again. And in the Solihull approach, containment begins with very young babies, and their needs for good enough attainment in order that those complex, difficult emotions that come later can be received and understood and handed back. And that provides the beginnings of that kind of emotional regulation and that you know, individual resilience, really. So it's about the ability to contain the emotions of another, and it's also recognizing that this isn't about dumping. It's kind of acting as a sponge and allowing another person to get rid of their feelings, if you like. But it's not the same as reassurance, which can feel like we're just kind of sweeping ideas, worries aside, and we're not taking them seriously. It's hearing that emotion and it's feeding it back in a way that feels more manageable for the child. And with a baby, that means that the parent is able to free their own mind to think about the baby's communication. So that's where that kind of need for the caregiver to be available is really important. They can accept that communication and make sense of it, and then convey that back to the baby and show that they're thinking about them with care. So that's how it kind of starts. With adults, it's obviously more of a 2-way process. And in primary schools, we might need to go right back to the beginning with a parent and build up a story of how the child is, where they are now. But we see that containment in lots of different relationships. Often we're doing it already. Most of the time we're doing it already, but it's really helpful to name it, to recognise it, and to be conscious of it, and to be sharing these ideas with parents so that they're recognising what they're doing. But we also know that there are times when containment might not be possible. So there are times when there is just no room in the caregiver's head to hold that baby in mind because their head is too full of other things. And so they don't have the room to contain that baby's normal emotional needs. And we've looked at a few of those factors already. That can be things like postnatal depression, too many overwhelming factors for mum, financial concerns, alcohol or substance misuse. For whatever reason, that caregiver is just not able to, take on board someone else's emotions because they're not managing their own. But a person that would be good at containing others is someone who's receptive, who's able to hold on to another person's difficult feelings without being overwhelmed by them themselves, and who's able to make calm and thoughtful attempts to understand a problem, and someone that can convey that a feeling that what the other person is feeling is meaningful but also manageable. And then the second avenue of that kind of framework of Solihull is reciprocity or attunement. So it's the same idea, really. And this begins from the moment of birth. And the idea is that there's this, you'll hear the term of a kind of dance of reciprocity. So, as soon as a child is born, there's something like a dance that occurs in that typical parent-child relationship, where there'll be a signal or response from one person in that party, and that will then be responded to by the other, and it goes backwards and forwards. And the parent would be showing sensitivity to the needs and feelings of the child, and the child would then be responding to the parent. So it's just quite a nice way of sharing that idea of an attachment cycle with parents, is talking to them about reciprocity and attunement and being responsive, to the child's needs. Because it's essentially talking about it as a two-way flow of communication. And we know that in interactions where there's reciprocity, a person can both affect and be affected by the other because they're in tune with each other. And it's observed, as I said, in those first few hours of life, where a baby can recognise familiar smells and sounds. They know their mum's voice as soon as they're born, and they will respond with preferences based on that knowledge. So all healthy relationships that we have around us involve interactions which are reciprocal. And this is kind of comes from the idea that babies aren't born as blank slates that have things done to them. They come into the world ready to relate to other people, and they are especially programmed to attach to their mothers and to their primary caregivers. Is there anything else that is important to say about this? Reciprocity is also the cornerstone for all future relationships. So it's things like the infant being able to accept an additional person coming into that relationship, so a three-way relationship. And it's also the basis for development of language and communication, and for self-control and regulation and so on. It's about giving out and taking in, signalling and receiving. So it's learning that kind of two-way interaction, essentially, and developing that rhythm or that pattern of interaction that as infants we then begin to internalize. So it's what lays the foundation for our future models of social interaction. We can experience rupture and repair in our reciprocal relationships. So there will be times when those relationships are ruptured, but what's important is that we repair them again, and that's what helps to build resilience. So going back to that infant attachment cycle, we know that it's never going to be perfect. It does just need to be good enough parenting. And what we do know about when things don't go right, so that what we call a rupture, it is important to make attempts to repair it. So it's doing things like saying you're sorry, showing that you got it wrong. That's what helps to build young people's resilience and trust that we can solve problems together. And again, there's a couple of links there to show you some examples of reciprocity and ideas of reciprocity happening in all of our different relationships. So you can see it there with a mother and child, you can see it between different children, with an adult and a pet. You know, it happens in all of our relationships, that kind of to and fro, that dance of interaction. So yeah, do go and have a look at some of those video clips that are linked there, because they give some nice examples. I think what is useful to know here is that feedback from parents and carers has showed that the most effective intervention for them has been to become reattuned to the child's needs and able to contain them. So parents that have been involved in working through this Solihull model and so on, they've kind of fed back that what's been most important is about them getting reattuned to their child and being able to recognise those needs again, so that they can respond appropriately. And sometimes, you know, actually that's just where families need a little bit more help, is establishing that attunement again and recognising each other's needs. When thinking about reciprocity, we can also consider the learning triangle, which was introduced by Heather Geddes. And this is a useful model to look at attachment in the classroom. So from an attachment perspective, a child who's got a secure attachment will allow the child to disengage from an interaction with the adult and become interested in objects and activities without separation. And those experiences then enhance and excite further interest and provide that basis for initial learning. So there's that kind of curiosity there, because that reassurance and encouragement from the primary caregiver enables them to feel safe enough to do so. It contains their anxiety, and therefore, you know, they go off and act independently, and their experience builds up and their knowledge grows. So they're able to detach from the adult to engage with other aspects of that learning environment. In the classroom, we would see the task as being the new object or the experience. So that's what they're going off to engage with. And engaging with that task involves trusting the teacher to support their uncertainty and to resolve confusion if they encounter that. So the classroom and the teacher are essentially seen as the secure base for the child, whereas the task is the new experience that they are feeling confident enough to engage with. What's really important to say there? They know that they can trust the teacher when needed, which allows them to engage in their task. And they've also got that increased ability to focus on the task, and they feel more able to problem solve themselves and to face challenge, and because they know the teacher is available for support if needed. But we can also think about this model in terms of the insecure attachment styles, and that allows us to consider whether it's the relationship with the task or the supporting adult that actually needs the intervention. So, for example, in a child who has an avoidant attachment style, the child would want to engage independently with the task, and they would struggle to engage appropriately with the teacher due to the uncertainty and anxiety linked to the availability of acceptance and support. So in that case, the task is the starting point through which the teacher can seek to engage the child. So they shouldn't be trying to engage the child through their relationship with each other, but they should be using the task to mediate that. In contrast, the child with an ambivalent or resistant attachment style would be seeking proximity to the teacher at the expense of being able to engage with the task. So they wouldn't be able to engage in that learning experience because they would be needing that relationship with the teacher more. And that relates to their separation anxiety. So therefore, the mediating factor would be the other way around. And in disorganised children, or those with a disorganised style, both the task and the teacher would be perceived as threatening. So the teacher would be seen as unreliable, whereas the task would threaten their fragile sense of self, because they've got little capacity to reflect and they're very sensitive to criticism. And so going back to that kind of Solihull model, the idea is that if we can actually emotionally contain the child and relate to them reciprocally, then that behaviour management will begin to develop independently. And so therefore they would then begin to be able to engage with those elements. And I would really suggest going away again and doing some further research, reading on this idea of a learning triangle by Heather Geddes, because it's really useful when thinking about how these children might be presenting in the classroom, and what interventions might be helpful for those different attachment styles. Okay, so why is early child development relevant? We've thought about this a lot already, but I think this slide just captures it nicely. So I'm not going to, go into this in great detail, but it gives you a nice kind of flow diagram as to why that early relationship is so important, why that healthy attachment cycle is so key, because it's providing that containing and reciprocal relationship, which then allows for that, healthy model, and also that, greater brain development. So that is just a nice reflection, really, of the ideas that we've been talking about. And then the final part of our Solihull model, so we've had containment, we've thought about reciprocity, is to think about behaviour management. Obviously, we know that behaviour can provoke really difficult feelings. It can be experienced as provocative, alarming, distressing, and as adversely affecting children's learning. But it is important to remember that behaviour has meaning, and it is communication about a child's social and emotional experience. Behaviour management is part of the ordinary process of normal development, where we teach our children self-control, and parents in well-functioning families will work together to put reasonable boundaries on children's behaviour, and will encourage that child with attention and with other rewards. And then through that process, the child becomes able to internalise those restraints and satisfactions for themselves. But there are times when it goes wrong, and that's often in relation to these children that have these insecure attachment styles where those cycles aren't well formed. So it's about thinking back to, okay, what is this behaviour communicating about their social and emotional experiences, and how can we intervene to support that? So having a think about what behaviour management techniques you use in school. Do they work sometimes? Do they work usually? Do they work always? If they don't work always, why not? And obviously keep in mind that the Solihull approach would suggest that actually we need to have containment and reciprocity before we're able to manage behaviour successfully. So if they're not working well for your individual child or young person, are there elements of intervention that we can put in to support those aspects of containment and reciprocity, in the hope that behaviour management would then follow as children are better able to regulate themselves? So that's things to be thinking about when you're thinking about the strategies that you're already using. Keep that in mind. And this just reflects that idea, really, that all behaviour is communication. So when you are thinking about support for your child or young person, ask yourself, given what I know about this child and their development, what is it that this child is trying to tell me? Behaviour is a projection of what the child is feeling, and it often resembles their vulnerability and their lack of control, and can be communicating things like, don't forget me, I need you, please listen, I can't manage on my own. So be thinking about what it is that child is trying to convey to you. Many of these children are hypervigilant, they've got really high anxiety levels, so something very tiny can knock them off course. They can be in a constant state of alertness. As we've thought about, their responses are governed by that limbic system due to their lack of neuronal pathways. So they are constantly in that sense of fight or flight. And that just means that they're so overwhelmed by their emotions. That's what they're responding to, because they haven't learned to tolerate that uncertainty due to that lack of modelling. And they need help to, develop those neural pathways and to be able to sit with those emotions and to feel them and know that they can feel safe in doing so. Also important to bear in mind that there will always be a trigger, although it may not be external or visible, and that you can use things like ABC charts and so on to begin to consider those and try and unpick them. But yeah, thinking about what is this child trying to communicate to me? How can I best manage that? And do I need to take it back to those earlier stages of containment and reciprocity? And this is normally an activity that I would work through with the group that I was doing attachment training with. Obviously, we can't do that today because it's a remote session, and a lot of you will be watching this back as a recording, but this would be a really nice activity for you to just try yourselves with the aim of putting this Solihull approach into practice. So have a think about what you already do and what you might do more of or do differently, and look at each of these points. So what could we be doing to promote good containment in our school? How can we further develop that? What can we do to promote good reciprocity in our school? How could we further develop that? And then what can we do to promote good behaviour management in our school? And maybe just sit and have a think about a couple of points under each of those 3 areas that you might be able to develop in your schools in order to kind of promote that Solihull approach and to support children with different attachment styles. So can be a really powerful activity. So if you have some time at the end of your session, spend a few minutes doing that, or perhaps, you know, go back to it with as small groups and do that as an activity together if you get the chance to. Okay, so what are the key messages and some of the interventions and strategies to think about today? I think key messages are about trying to understand the child's internal working model. What have their attachment experiences been? Look for the child's resources rather than their deficits. Keep that Solihull approach in mind. So think about containment, reciprocity and behaviour management as a way of approaching those attachment difficulties. And remember that the behaviour management element comes last. Treat the child as they're an expert. What is that behaviour trying to communicate to you? Consider the importance of those relationships. You know, how can you help them to develop that trust? How can we form those secure bases in school? And think about allowing children some control so that they feel safer and secure in their environment. Look at planning so that they're prepared for beginnings and endings. It's about providing consistency, stability and secure boundaries, including routines. It's about adults being consistently positive towards the child. So and therefore then being able to separate their child from their behaviour and being able to move on once that's been dealt with. It's thinking about things like having a key person who can provide positive attachment experiences for the child and can consistently meet that child's physical and emotional needs so that they learn to develop that trust. It's about providing that reassurance for children. It's giving them that structured environment and activities. And it's also thinking about alternative key adults for children so that when that main adult isn't available, there is still someone there. So it's really about thinking, okay, what is it that's going on for this child? What is their internal working model? And where can we put in place that intervention? At what level of that, you know, Solihull model and so on, would it be best to be providing some support for this child? And talking that through with families as well. That's a nice model to be using with them. So think again about the children you're working with. Who is this person? How do they feel? How do they think? What is that schema? What assumptions are they making about me, about others, about the world around them? And therefore, what support can I put in place to best facilitate the development of those supporting adult relationships? Okay, and I have left you with a number of really useful resources for further reading. So yeah, that Louise Bomber book at the top is a really lovely book and really helpful for thinking through practical strategies for children with attachment difficulties, and also explaining, you know, it explains some of what's going on behind some of those behaviours, as well as thinking about appropriate interventions. So do have a look at that if you get a chance to. Also, you know, read some literature around nurture groups, which have been a really powerful approach in schools. Have a look at the information from GEDIS, because that gives some information about interventions that you can put in place in the classroom for children with attachment difficulties. There's just some, yeah, lots of really lovely resources there to go away and have a look at. And also, you know, some studies and so on relating to attachment and the connections with learning and school readiness and so on. And then finally, there's also some internet references there. So you can go away and look a bit more at the Solihull approach and at different attachment styles, and do go away and have a look at things like the strange situation in a bit more detail as well.
Okay, so welcome to Attachment Difficulties, How Can You Help? Hopefully you'll have seen Claire Cahill's presentation on attachment and the theory behind attachment difficulties. If you haven't, that probably would be best to watch first. If not, please watch afterwards. All the strategies within this will support a variety of children, not just those with attachment difficulties. And much of what I talk about today is fundamental for all children. And will ensure good practice for all children to be able to learn and experience and be safe and secure with their attachments. To reiterate what Claire said in her presentation, attachment difficulties also present in similar ways to other conditions such as ASC. So be mindful of that when looking at the difficulties a child may be experiencing. I'm Becky Davis. I'm a specialist support worker for Dover STLS. And I recently joined in March. Since before that, I was working in a preschool, and then I worked as a one-to-one in mainstream. I've worked as a SENIF practitioner, so I've got a vast experience with lots of different age groups. Let's share my screen. Okay, so when I was working as a manager of a nursery school, I asked the staff to shuffle around on their bottoms. Apart from them all thinking I'd finally lost the plot, they made for some interesting discussions. For example, what displays look like from that view, what resources could be accessed, what was difficult for them. We also discussed how intimidating it felt when adults were stood above us, which is something that we don't really look at as adults because we're usually the ones standing up tall. So from this, we changed like the levels of display, we changed how we spoke to the children, made sure we always were getting down on their level. Outside is a key example of that. We tend not to get down on their level and talk to the children. So provided the staff with knee pads so they could do that in the garden without getting cold and wet knees. And it's important to realise that sometimes the children's perception of things is different to what we assume. And that's quite a key way of looking at how children are perceiving their environment, for example. I worked with a child in mainstream education and I wore a family tree necklace. And he'd once asked about it, and I told him that it was, you know, so that when I wasn't around my family, I was still with them and I felt that I could feel them, and it was because I missed them. And months passed, and then one morning I snapped my necklace, getting ready for work. And so I just put a different one on and went to work, didn't think much about it. And he was very different that day. He wasn't very engaged with me. He didn't want to participate in what I was offering him. And when I spoke to him about it, he said, "Don't you miss your family anymore?" And I didn't make the connections, and I spoke to him for a little while and just still didn't get it. And the day proceeded, and I just wasn't really understanding what the issue was and why he wasn't engaged with me. So in the end, I asked him, why is it that you're not really engaged with me today? Why is it you don't want to work? Blah, blah, blah. And he said it's because I didn't care about my family anymore. And we've had a further discussion, and we discovered it was because I wasn't wearing my necklace. And I explained how I'd broken it, and that it wasn't I didn't miss my family, it was just that my necklace was broken and therefore I couldn't wear it. And the rest of the day was kind of back to normal, which just kind of goes to prove how differently the children perceive things, and how we shouldn't assume what they're feeling or assume that it's just a difficult day for them. Maybe delving that, using that professional curiosity to look a bit deeper into what they're feeling and what they're thinking. Because actually, if I'd have had that discussion with him earlier on in the day, we would have got to a level of him being more engaged more quickly. But because I didn't have that conversation, it took most of the day for us to resolve the issues that he was feeling. So again, with the professional curiosity, take the time to talk to the children you're working with, delve that little bit deeper, so you can understand the child's personal construct, their experiences and their views. You have to be mindful not to lead children by assuming how they feel or how you expect them to feel about a given situation. Try not to make assumptions about how you would feel, because actually we're all different, and something that will really affect me in one way won't affect the next person. So in essence, we really just need to listen to the child. Interventions such as Talking About, which is by Black Sheep Press, gives opportunities for children to explore scenarios. There's an example on the slide. So you could use this as a way of entering into dialogue about how people are feeling and what they could be feeling and what the child thinks they could be feeling. So the one on the screen obviously is a girl with holding a bag, and so what's the other girl talking to her about? Is she saying about how a weekend went, and the other girl looking a bit confused? Maybe she's worried because actually she didn't have a very good weekend and they didn't really do very much that day. Or maybe she's feeling like, oh, I need to be mindful about this because this is a new person speaking to me. It's just about opening up that dialogue about how people's perceptions of things, and understanding friendship groups and families. And there's lots of different cards. They've got different scenario cards to go with them. So you can explore a variety of things that might happen around that scenario. So it might be that you can look at things about, how does the girl feel? Have you ever felt that way? What made you feel like that? I felt like that. Always bring it back to yourself as well, and be able to give them examples of how that feeling's okay, and we've all experienced it at some point. So they act as kind of a conversation starter and help to develop the skills around emotional and personal development. Another way to do this is showing children video clips and asking them to analyse the behaviours they see and interpret what might happen, how the characters are feeling. This can be done with lots of different scenarios. So you could do it with soap operas, for example, or you could do videos of themselves when they're interacting, just so they can analyse kind of how people are feeling, how they're feeling. It kind of provides children with a method to explore aspects of their lives in a safe and secure way, rather than being on the spot and having to think quickly. It's a kind of a way of rehearsing communication and making them feel safe and secure in their own knowledge. Also on the screen is two households, and this is quite a good way for children who have got multiple households within their family. For example, mum and dad's, or mum and dad's and nan and grandad's. Just gives them an idea to be able to explore what presents in those different houses. So there's some cue cards there, and how they differ, how they're similar, how that child feels in each house, what they really like about each house, what they don't like. And again, is a conversation starter for developing how the child feels about different aspects of their life. So when we're talking about managing feelings, it's really important to remember that it's difficult for all children. And when they're in a heightened state, children find it increasingly difficult to apply the strategies to manage their feelings and in turn their behaviours. So it's really important that you choose a method that suits the individual child. So some children will need a discrete method, such as a wristband, which are displayed on the screen. And these can be turned over to say, I'm okay or I'm not okay. And the adult can see that and act appropriately. Others might be able to vocalise their thoughts and feelings easily and manage using the 5-point scale or the zones of regulation. And it's important we give children opportunities to recognise their own feelings, help them to identify strategies to help them. So we're helping to co-regulate them. Also, something that's missed by quite a lot of adults is something that we don't often do, is by role modelling our own feelings. It's really important for children to know that the feelings are absolutely normal, and it's how we deal with those feelings that we need to evaluate. So we're the role models, and so when I do a feelings check-in, I'll often say to the children, oh, when I got up this morning, I dropped my coffee. And then that made me late because I knew I was going to have to clear it up, and then I needed a shower because it spilt on me, and I was feeling really anxious because I didn't want to be late for you all. But luckily my son came down and he made me a new coffee while I was in the shower, and I came down, I drank my coffee, and I was on time in the end. So that was really good. My son really helped me to regulate those feelings. And now I'm really happy, or now I'm less anxious. So just a way of understanding that these feelings are what people feel. They're not abnormal. They are absolutely justified and valid feelings. And we need to give that ownership to the children about their feelings, and also help them to understand that they're as valid as the next person's, and everyone's feelings are different about different scenarios. We also need to show them that a blip at the start of the day or the middle of the day doesn't kind of disregard the rest of the good stuff that happened in that day. We all have elements of the day that didn't go as well as we'd hoped, but that doesn't mean that all aspects of the day are ruined. And I think that's really key to get children to remember, and helping them support their emotional regulation. Be mindful of children who have learnt their own coping mechanisms, so that for the children that go and get that extra glass of water or need a toilet break every 5 minutes, they may well be self-regulating. So depending on the level of disruption that causes to the class, you can decide whether or not that needs to be kind of tailored in a more appropriate manner, or whether actually for them that's needed and that works for you as a classroom as well. So you could offer a safe space for the children as an alternative, but obviously again that is dependent on the level of disruption their coping mechanism is causing you. Also remember to enable the children to regulate effectively. So if adults try and restore too soon, the child may be re-triggered and behaviours will escalate again. There's a graph on the slide that shows this, that you've got your baseline behaviour, you have the trigger, it escalates and you reach crisis phase. As you're coming out of that crisis phase, if additional assaults might happen by adults intervening too early. So what you actually don't want to do is you want to give it enough time for children to be able to bring themselves down with or without your assistance. But if you intervene too early, you will re-escalate that. So that's really important to give that time to allow the children to work through that. So example of this is that often with children, they have verbal ways of showing their feelings, and sometimes they'll have behaviours to show their feelings. So the child that I work with would often hum when he was happy, which is lovely, and he'd also hum when he was anxious. So for many, this was the same hum. So my teacher, oh, he's really happy, look, he's humming. And I'd be like, no, he's really anxious. And because I was in tune with him and I understood that, I was able to de-escalate that before he got to crisis point, which is really, really valuable. If you can reach them before they get to the crisis point, it's easier to bring them back down and easier for them to discuss things with you. It was just a slightly different tone to the hum. So to know the child was to know when that hum was coming and to know when that hum was slightly different. So this is an example of attunement, which Claire spoke about, and the value of how we can support children effectively if we're attuned to them. Another thing that Claire mentioned is that all behaviour is communication, and we need to ensure we're actively teaching this to children, that all feelings are valid, and it's how we manage the feelings. So it's not the feelings that we don't want, it's some of the behaviours that are displayed because of the feelings. And that's really important to let children know. So using social scripts that are consistent amongst all staff are really useful for managing emotions. So, for example, the I wonder, I imagine, I noticed, the win. I wonder if you're feeling sad. I imagine that's because you couldn't bring your dog to school. That would make me sad too. So you're validating it. I notice you have a picture of your dog in your bag. Should we go and have a look at it? So you're acknowledging the feelings and affirming that it's okay to feel that way and offering a strategy to help them. That way they can kind of learn how to manage those emotions, knowing that that's okay, but also being able to put things in place to help them. Children with attachment difficulties are likely to have lower self-esteem and poor self-image. It's critical that we use strategies to support the well-being of the children and find opportunities for praise and self-awareness while providing opportunities to foster independence. It's a lovely feeling to be needed and wanted by the child, and as a one-to-one that's quite difficult to manage sometimes, but the aim is for the children to become resilient and confident and adaptive. So actually they need to be able to regulate their own feelings, their own self-worth and their own knowledge about themselves and their experiences. So for this, giving the praise, making sure the praise is appropriate. Some children really like all singing or dancing praise, like well done, fireworks example. But other children would like a discreet just tap on the shoulder, well done. Be specific with the praise you're giving. So always use their name and what is the behaviour that you're seeing that you're really liking. So example is, Patricia, I like it when you listen to me. I can tell you're listening because you're looking at me. Remembering to use their name and reiterate what they can do. So Sam, I know you can do that because you use your growth mindset when things are tricky. Tell them how proud you are of them, and again, be specific. Julie, I'm so proud of the way you helped Ben with his coat. So you're acknowledging what they've done, you're saying what you've seen that's really good behaviour and the wanted behaviours, and you're making it specific to them. Children will gain pride in their achievements, and you'll help them to recognise the positives within themselves. Peer support is good for this too. So circle of friends is an intervention that can be used to help children gain support networks from their peers and help them to make and maintain friendships. Just understanding their role within the group, what other people see that is worthy, and give them a self-awareness and a good self-esteem to acknowledge what other people see as good characteristics of themselves. Drawing the ideal self, I put a link on the slide. It's a method used to gain an insight into the child and gain an awareness of how they view themselves and others. So it enables the dialogue between the adult and the child again. So the child would first draw a picture of someone they would really like to be. And they might have very long hair, and you can ask them to add a bag. What kind of bag would this person carry? Where would they be? You can make it as elaborate or as basic as you need it to be. And then you're going to identify somebody on a separate piece of paper that is someone they wouldn't like to be. And again, add the bag. What would their bag look like? So it might be a really, really heavy bag or a dirty bag. What you need to be mindful of it is to describe exactly what the child is saying onto the pictures. We're not interpreting, and we mustn't pass judgment. So do not do the look of, they've said that. We need to be mindful of how we're responding to the child at the time. And then you'd have a discussion surrounding them, surrounding the two people and about the characteristics they're displaying and what the child views them as. And then you're going to add a piece of paper in the middle, so horizontally, and draw a line across it. And you're going to ask the child where they feel that they sit between these two identities. Again, you describe their thoughts and their feelings as to why they have placed themselves there. And it's a starting point to build their self-esteem. So for some children, as Claire, I think, stated, would be very self-confident, and they would put themselves as, one of the best people in the world. But sometimes this isn't actually how they feel about themselves. So it's about delving that a little bit deeper, using your professional curiosity again. All About Me is great. It builds that connection between the adult and the child about their favourite things, their strengths, where they fit into the family, how many siblings they've got, and it gives an awareness of that social dynamic that child fits in. So that helps the adult to connect with the child and understand how they might be feeling about certain aspects of their lives. Choices and control. So we offer choices as part of empowering all children, and it helps develop a sense of self and empowers the child to take responsibility of what they're saying and what they're choosing to do. when the child becomes an active participant in this, they are usually more willing to engage, and therefore better outcomes are achieved. Children with attachment difficulties may feel they have little control or choice in their lives. And so by offering them choices, you're offering to hand back the control of situations. We need to help them to make the right choices. So when you're offering choices, make sure they're choices that are okay, they're appropriate, and that they're going to lead to a behaviour that you want. So if a child doesn't want to sit in literacy input, you're going to ask them they can either sit here or here. So you're going to get the right response because you want them to sit, but you're giving them a choice of where they're going to sit. So you need to remain an element of control. You need to offer safe and appropriate choices, and you need to take time to discuss the options. Often we as adults assume that the children know what the consequences of the choices they're making are. And actually that's not always the case. So it's about being really explicit in the way you're offering the choices and the consequences of that choice. So again, with this, when we're saying no to a child, often for children that's very difficult to handle. So thinking about different ways of saying no. If you say no, the child can be defensive, retreat, display challenging behaviours. So instead of no, we can say, I understand you want to play that game, but first we need to complete our literacy and then we can play the game. So you're not saying no, you're saying not right now. Children feel they've been heard, they feel they've been understood, and that the time will be given to them. So again, you're still remaining in control of the situation, but you're empowering the child. It's equally important to support children in making the right choices in terms of social interaction. So again, we can use the social scripts for this and enable them to make a flow chart. So this is the choice we could make. This is the situation that will occur from that. Is that a good consequence? Is that how we want life to pan out? The talking about interventions are really good for this because you can discuss the different scenarios, discuss how you could operate within that scenario and what consequence that would give you. Another method of this is role play. Role play can be really helpful for children to understand how someone else might respond given the choice that the child makes themselves. So key to attachment is this trusting, safe and responsive relationships. On the screen I've put a quote that I think is, I say a lot, I care about you and I'm here to keep you safe. So when the child's displaying levels of behaviour that are inappropriate, your response is that I care about you and I'm here to keep you safe. So responsive and reliable adults have often been absent from a child with attachment difficulties. It's fundamental to all children to form those secure attachments. But for those who've had poor experiences with attachments and relationships previously, it's essential. So we need to be supportive, we need to be consistent, and we need to be sensitive while offering clear boundaries and predictability. This is where your visual timetables come in, your transitions, your SAN timers to prepare for transitions, all those things that are in place to ensure that it's a predictable environment for the children. When the child is displaying challenging behaviours, as I say, a good script to use is I care about you and I'm here to keep you safe. So that they know that you're not stopping them from doing those behaviours for no reason. It's because you want to keep them safe and it's because you care about them. So again, you're giving them that self-worth and that understanding that they are important and their feelings are important, but we need to manage that differently. So children learn how to make and maintain relationships by their own life experiences. So if this has been a difficult scenario for them, if adults come and go from their lives or they're not as responsive, this can be really tricky for children as they build up their social construct by these experiences. So it's imperative that the adults supporting them are role modelling good relationships, enable the children to feel valued and respected. A great way of doing this is remembering something about the child. So a child will say to you, oh, I'm going to mummy's at the weekend. Awesome. So on Monday, you're going to find that child and you're going to say, hey, I remember you said you were going to mummy's at the weekend. How was that? Tell me about that. So they know that they were important enough for you to remember that they were going to see their mum at the weekend, and they're important enough that you're going to ask them how that went. It's important, however, to be mindful of the triggers and ensure the child feels safe. So you asking the question in a non-threatening way. You're not there to gain information, but merely seeking that trust and that reciprocal relationship. Key to this is adults needing to be resilient. So children with poor attachment may display levels of behaviour that are difficult to manage and understand. Key to this is it isn't about you. They don't want to hurt you. They're safeguarding themselves from the possibility of being hurt. And to combat, the adults need to be resilient and consistent in their approach. And this can be particularly challenging because as adults, we like to fix things. Well, we need to enable the child to feel safe and secure and offer opportunities to develop containment. So when I left early years, I became a TA in a mainstream school, and I supported a child who had his one-to-one for 2 years. And now I was employed to be that person. So I spent the first 3 months of my role wondering if I'd made the right choice, what I was doing wrong. The child was distressed daily, he was displaying challenging behaviours daily, and it took some work. My approach was consistent, the boundaries were firm and clear, and I was responsive to his needs. And we built an amazing relationship and spent the following 2 years learning and achieving together. Because it wasn't that he didn't want me or something that I wasn't doing right. It was that he wanted his previous one-to-one, the security of the knowledge of the previous person. So he tried and he tested me to see if I could be trusted and if I'd be reliable. Listening to him and understanding how he was feeling was key to that, key to understanding how he was perceiving this. His old one-to-one had left him, this new one-to-one was here, and he didn't really want that. He wanted the old one. He wanted the reliable, predictable person he'd had for 2 years. So what I needed to do was prove to him that I was trusted, I was safe, I was responsive, and I was reliable for him. So I've also had personal experience with attachment difficulties, and the thing I find most difficult to manage is when I say, I love you, and the reply comes, thanks. And it's taken me some time and some tears probably to analyse what this means. And I've kind of reached the conclusion that the reason it's so difficult for me to accept the response, it feels like I'm being rejected. So my feeling is that I'm being rejected. But what I need to be mindful of is when the answer does come back, I love you, it means so much more because it's from the heart. It's not a learnt response. It's something that the child is feeling right there, right then. So I think we need to be mindful of our own feelings in it, and how this will affect the relationship we have with children. You need to be able to put your feelings to one side to support the child effectively. And working as a one-to-one is a tricky job. You need to be mindful of your own well-being, and you might need to seek advice and some guidance. You need to take time for you to ensure you support the child appropriately. You need to build that independence and offer strategies for self-regulation. If the child depends on you and can only manage with your support, they'll not learn to manage their emotions and feelings effectively. It's worth noting that with attunement, their needs and feelings will affect both parties. So be mindful of your own well-being at that point. Often we take on those feelings and then we don't do anything with those. So really be mindful of having those discussions with staff, team members, and being able to talk through the things that you find difficult, because that's all part of the learning process and we're all in it together. So the child's learning about how they're dealing with their emotions, and equally we're also learning about how to deal with emotions. Ruby and the Rubbish Bin is it's a book by Margot Sunderland, and emphasises the difference a responsive adult can make in a child's life. Really lovely book. So the key points: use your professional curiosity to see things through the eyes of the child, enable clarity of situations, provide the child with strategies to enable regulation, to manage their feelings and articulate them appropriately. remembering that all behaviours are communication, and actually there will be a trigger to that behaviour, just that we don't know it and we don't experience it isn't enough. For example, for that is a child that I used to work with, wouldn't go into a certain room in the school. He'd always been happy in that room. There was an issue after half term, he would not go into that room and couldn't really get to the bottom of it. And I discovered that actually it was because the room had been painted in the half term, and although it was the same colour, the smell of paint was still faintly there. And for him, that was a very poignant smell to him, and he's really struggled with that. So it's not necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily see the trigger, but there will be a trigger, and there will be a reason, a communication need that child is trying to give you by displaying those behaviours. Remember to give the time children to calm before restoring, otherwise you'll have that re-escalation. Enable the child to feel valued and respected, and empower them to make choices. Again, offering those choices, those safe choices for them to make. Providing relationships are meaningful and reliable. Be the adult that they seek, but remember to be appropriate with your the way you respond, and ensure that you're offering opportunities for them to self-regulate as well. Providing safe spaces for child to access when needed. Calming boxes are great for this, to offer a safe space that the child can take themselves to and de-escalate themselves with a calming box, with sort of sensory toys, things like that. Key to everything is take care of yourselves. You can't fill others' cups from an empty teapot. Something someone told me years and years ago, and it's really stuck with me. It's so true. You need to look after your own well-being to be able to support other people's well-being. Remember to use your key phrases and your social scripts. So I wonder, I imagine, I notice. Make sure you're validating those feelings for those children, and that they're important enough for you to notice them. Specific praise about what the child is doing well. Use their name. Tell them exactly, not you're a good friend, why they're a good friend. You're a great friend because I saw you share your toys with Peter. And inform the child that they're important. I care about you and I'm here to keep you safe. Really key points to remember for all children, but especially those with attachment difficulties. Thank you very much, and I will see you all very soon.